Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Pennington Cross. I'm the Executive Associate Dean of the College of Business. So it's good to see so many students in one place. And since I've started this new job, since I was faculty, I haven't seen so many students in one place in the last year and a half. So it's good to see everyone. So I'm here to introduce David Autor. Or Dr. David Autor. So first, I want to kind of touch on, what is the Marburg Lecture? The Marburg Lecture series is named in the honor of late Theodore F. Marburg, a longtime member of the economics department. The goal of the Marburg Memorial Lecture is to provide a forum for the discussion of moral, philosophical, and social dimensions of economic issues. With a focus on economic aspects of peace and justice. The Marburg Lecture is made possible by the generosity of the Marburg family and through support for the Center of Applied Economics. Over the last 10 years, the lecture has hosted a host of highly respected economists from premier economic departments across the United States. And my notes say here that of the last 10 people who have talked here, 2 were Nobel laureates, and I believe only one of them was a Nobel laureate before they came here, but they became a Nobel laureate afterwards. So 22 out of 10 is good math, so that's 20%. That's an incredible number. I would just say that as a faculty member at Marquette for all these years, this has always been one of my favorite events to always go to. I would always learn a lot, and it was always by very, very highly respected I would call famous economists come here, and today's no exception to that. Let's say a little bit about Dr. David Autor. He's the Daniel and Gail Rubenfeld Professor at MIT in the Department of Economics. He's the co-director of the NBER Labor Studies Program and the MIT Shaping the Future Work Initiative. His scholarship explores the labor market impacts of technological change and globalization on job polarization, skill demands, earning levels and inequality, and electoral outcomes. The Economist has referred to Dr. Autor as the academic voice of the American worker. So this is the one event I can get my wife to come to at Marquette University. And unfortunately, she couldn't make it this year, but we were looking on Wikipedia about you, David, and so we had a good, we enjoyed looking through your papers over breakfast this morning. And so I just want to highlight 2 papers that piqued my interest this morning at the breakfast table. So the one answered a question that I think most economists are asked. So they said, oh, so this is happening, so tell me, what's going to happen? Something bad is happening. It's either A or B going to happen. And your paper answers the question the same way that I've often answered it. So the question of the title of this paper is a fairly recent paper of yours. Does automation replace experts or augment expertise? The answer is yes. Okay, so I think it's a very typical economist answer. So I just enjoyed that one for the title. And I really enjoyed reading about this other paper, so just want to highlight it. So the title of this one is The Unexpected Compression, Competition of Work in the Low-Wage Labor Market. So this is about what happened to wages during COVID-19. And the nominal wages for lower skill workers increased quite a lot and compressed the distribution from the low side up. But the biggest concentration of wage increases were on young non-college workers and those who were changing jobs. All right, so I think what we can take from here, and for us, especially if we're students, is that often to get really large increases in your wages, you may need to change your jobs. And so mobility is an important characteristics for all of us in a society that's become less mobile. So I encourage all of us just to think mobile thoughts, right? Not about where you're going to college, but about what you're going to do after college. Okay, so I'm looking forward. Hopefully, those are the couple things that were really kind of exciting to me, and then kind of piqued my interest in today's presentation. Dr. Autor has won a lot of awards. My notes say numerous awards, so I'm going to read a couple of them off. The National Science Foundation Career Award, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation Fellowship, the Sherman Rosen Prize for Outstanding Contributions to the Field of Labor Economics, Andrew Carnegie Fellowship in 2019, Social and Progress Medal in 2021, and the MIT Mac Vicker Faculty Fellowship, which I believe is a teaching award. And so that's another thing that I think many of your best teachers are also the most well-known and most productive researchers. So often research and teaching come hand in hand. So with that, I just want to remind everyone to hold your questions to the end. So we got the 2 mics, and at the end we can, if you have questions, feel free to kind of come up to the mic. But while Dr. Autor is speaking, please hold your questions. David, come on up.
Yeah. Whoa, that's not supposed to be there. Hold on. There we go. Okay, thank you. Great to see you all here. It's an honor to be here giving the Marburg Lecture. I didn't come for the 2 in 10 odds of getting the Nobel Prize. No one told me about that. I mean, it would have been quite a draw. So I want to speak about expertise, artificial intelligence, and the work of the future. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then I really welcome your questions. I think it's a topic on which all of us have opinions, and none of us have certainty, myself included. Hopefully you'll disagree with some of what I'm saying, and then we'll talk about that. So let me start off. I want you to do this thought exercise that I was asked to do recently at a conference I attended. The year is 2021. Here's a young woman weaving a rug on an ancient loom in India. Here are men in the Democratic Republic of Congo mining for cobalt. They don't have pickaxes. They don't have helmets. They don't have respirators. Pretty primitive way to work. Now let's imagine the year is 2034 and transformative AI enables machines to do virtually all the tasks humans currently do. Let's imagine how their work is transformed. That's right, not at all, right? And it's pretty clear why. There's already looms that you could use that don't have to be operated by hand. Obviously, we have pickaxes and respirators and helmets and flashlights for people. The reason that these tasks are not automated in so much of the world is because labor is so cheap. Labor is so cheap that it doesn't actually make sense to use machinery. This comes to a fundamental point that I want to start with. You might imagine that in the kind of richest countries in the world where we have so much technology, so much capital, so much infrastructure, that labor would play a relatively small part in economic activity because we have so much stuff that does so much work for us. But actually, the opposite is true. In North America, about 6 out of every $10 first is paid to workers before it circulates into the rest of the economy. The world average of that number is only about 50%. In parts of North Africa, it's as low as 45%. Right? In much of the world, labor is not that valuable. And when I mean not that valuable, I mean as a share of all economic activity. And one of the incredible achievements of modernity, actually, is despite or perhaps because of all the machines and technology we've produced, we have made ourselves more valuable. We've made our skills more valuable. And specifically, what we've made valuable is expertise. Expertise is what makes labor valuable in industrialized countries where physical activity is no longer as rewarded. So let me define terms. Expertise means domain-specific knowledge or competency to do something. Could be, coding an app, baking a loaf of bread, caring for a patient, remodeling a house. Not all expertise is economically valuable. You need 2 things. One, the goal that enables must itself have market value. So it's got to be data science, not card tricks. The other thing is it must be scarce, because if everyone is expert, no one is expert. Right? Expertise means the ability to do something that's worth doing that not everybody else knows how to do. Why should we care? Why does it matter? It matters because non-expert work pays poorly. So consider the following 2 jobs: air traffic controller, crossing guard. These are basically the same job, right? The job is to prevent collisions between things. Planes and planes, children and cars, same job. Air traffic controllers get paid 4 times as much as crossing guards. Why is that? It's not because what crossing guards do isn't really valuable, right? If we had to spend $130,000 a year to prevent our kids from being run over on the way to school, we would find the money. The answer is that to become a crossing guard in the United States requires no training or certification in almost any state. Any able-bodied adult can do that job. To become an air traffic controller, you need to spend years in air traffic control school and then thousands of hours of apprenticeship and training to do that work. So if we suddenly ran short on crossing guards, we could get all the air traffic controllers to do that work. If we suddenly ran short on air traffic controllers, the opposite would not be true. Right? So expertise is what distinguishes those jobs. And so I'm going to talk about the evolution of expertise across 3 periods of US history, or really of modern industrial history. The first one will be the Industrial Revolution. The second is the Computer Revolution. And the third is the AI era in which we have recently entered. So let me start with the Industrial Revolution. So prior to the advent of mass production in the mid-1700s, most things that were produced by hand by artisans who made one thing from back to front. You could be a blacksmith or a cobbler or a wheelwright, someone who did wagon wheels, right? And being an artisan, that was a highly revered activity. You apprentice into it while you're young, often through your family. You would buy the tools as you learn the expertise, and eventually you would embody that occupation. Only about 30% of people were artisans. Most of everyone else worked in agriculture. And this was a really high status, highly paid way of doing work. But it was incredibly inefficient, right? Making every single thing by hand, one at a time, is not a fast way or a cheap way to make things. The advent of mass production was a big idea. It wasn't just machinery. The idea was to take that artisanal work and break it into narrow, repetitive tasks that could be done by machines, unskilled workers, and managers. So what you're looking at here is an early loom in England. And a couple things here that stand out. One is that all the managers are men. The other is that all the workers are women, often unmarried or put into indentured servitude. They could be children. What you can't see from looking at this figure is actually how dirty and dangerous this work was, right? These were incredibly loud. It was incredibly polluted. The machines never stopped. It was easy to lose a finger or a limb or your life in one of these looms. This period, the transition from artisanal labor to mass production was a wrenching transition. The best evidence we have is that the earnings of the working class Brits didn't rise for the first 60 years of the Industrial Revolution, right? So people often talk about the Luddites, right? You've probably all heard the term. Who's heard the term Luddite? Anyone ever been called a Luddite? Okay. A Luddite means someone who's afraid of machinery, right? The Luddites rose up and they smashed the power looms. And they're often derided in history, but they were right to be worried. Their artisanal skills were wiped out by this new technology. Their expertise, which had been so hard-earned, was devalued by this new technology. Now, things begin to change, not for quite a while. In the mid-1800s, industrial mass production becomes much more sophisticated. The machines are more complex, the processes are more complex, the materials are more valuable, the expectations of consumers are much more demanding, and eventually you need workers who know something. People who are somewhat literate, somewhat numerate, so that they can follow rules and master tools. So when you look at mass production as it became, so here's the famous Ford River Rouge production plant. Those are office workers at International Harvester. They were numerate and they were literate and they were following rules and procedures. In fact, what was going on in offices was a lot like what was going on in factories, which was a set of rules for codifying, carrying out industrial tasks. And this was a very powerful and productive way to work. And from around 1860 or 1880 to around 1980, it powered the growth of middle classes in industrializing countries. I want to say not all by itself. There was also democracy. There were labor unions. There was laws and regulations, so it didn't do it all by itself. But this was an incredible foundation on which to build it because it was a highly productive way to use workers who had a high school education, typically that was the most they would have, they were literate and they were numerate, and they could interact with this machinery, produce stuff rapidly, and that contributed to rising standards of living. And it enshrined the value of mass expertise, this ability to carry out these procedures, whether on the factory floor or in the office, whether you were putting on bolts or whether you were filing and calculating and doing bookkeeping, right? Similar sets of skills were rewarded. That begins to change again in the 1970s or 1980s during the computer era, with the computer revolution. So let me give you a picture of the first computer that I used. Just kidding, this is not the first computer I use. This is the first industrial computer, the Jacquard loom of 1801. So what makes this a computer different from any machine that pre-existed is that it ran a program. Those brass things that you see, those are punch cards with instructions to the loom about which arms to lift and what patterns to weave. It is not a paint-by-numbers illustration. It really is a program. In fact, there's one surviving program by Jacquard himself of 10,000 cards that weaves a silk portrait of Jacquard himself. This machine acts, analyzes, and acts upon, it accesses, analyzes, and acts upon information. Right? And it was such a big idea, by the way. This punch card idea of storing information inspired Herman Holrith to invent the paper punch card that was used to read the 1890 US Census, the first machine-read census of populations. He joined forces with Thomas Watson to form the company IBM. Right? So really the genesis of the computer revolution is in this loom. And still, if you'll still, in certain fancy clothing stores, you'll see Jacquard knit X and Y, and they actually make quite elaborate patterns. Okay. But an important innovation of this machine is it could also follow rules and master tools, right? It could do many of those mass expertise tasks that were done by workers. It could take on a lot of that repetitive skilled work because it could be programmed, it could be coded up. But there's a big difference between computers and people in this period, which is that computers get much, much, much faster and cheaper. It's estimated there was at least a trillion-fold decline in the cost of computing between 1850 and 1950. Between 1850 and 2007. Most of it since 1950. What do I mean by the cost of computing? I mean that William Nordhaus, a Nobel Prize winner, tried to calculate the cost of doing 1 million calculations in every year from 1850 to 2007. So in 1850, right, you have people doing it by hand. And then in 1900, they're still doing it by hand. And then in the early 20th century, they have some adding machines and so on. But the cost is not coming down because even though the technology is getting better, labor is getting more expensive. And then around 1950, we have the vacuum tube, then the transistor, the integrated circuit, the microprocessor. And all of a sudden, the cost starts falling year on year until it falls trillionfold. So that's great for many things, but it created a lot of competition for workers, right? Workers who were doing things that could be codified and executed by machinery were suddenly competing with machines that were getting so cheap and fast. So if you look at the changes in the distribution of occupations in the United States, let's say from 1980 to 2015, ranked from low pay to high pay. So on the bottom, you have personal services like food service, cleaning, entertainment, security, recreation. In the middle, you have a lot of office, clerical, and production work. And on the top, you have professional, technical, and managerial workers. You see this kind of sagging in the middle and this barbell phenomenon. What that middle sag reflects is computers increasingly are doing the work of production workers and office workers because those tasks are well understood and they can be codified on those punch cards, right? Just like with the Jacquard loom. That was an amazing accomplishment. So it replaced a lot of production workers, and so it kind of started to undo the value of mass expertise that had arisen during the industrial era. Now you might look at that picture and say, okay, why only the middle? Why not the edges? Well, the answer is what some call Polanyi's paradox, after the philosopher Michael Polanyi, who said, we know more than we can tell. Many of the things that we do, we actually don't know the rules for doing them, right? We don't know the rules for coming up with a funny joke, or an interesting hypothesis, or making a compelling argument in a legal case, or proving a theorem. We know the rules for proving a theorem, hypothesizing a theorem. We also don't know the rules for many of the dexterous tasks we do. So when you learn to ride a bicycle, right, your parents did not give you a lesson in gyroscopic physics, right? They put you on your bike on a gentle hill and gave you a push and said, good luck with that. Hope that works out. But of course, that's because many of the things we learn tacitly, right? We don't learn them explicit. We learn them from experience, and we induct the rules, right? And we learn the procedures, and it's never articulated. But why is that important? We couldn't historically computerize things that we didn't explicitly understand, right? If we couldn't write the program, we couldn't get the machine to do it, right? And how many of you have done computer programming at some level? Okay, good, all right. So you know how stupid computers are, right? Did you ever write a program and you think, how could it be confused by that? It's obvious what I meant, right? But of course, it doesn't think for itself, right? It doesn't exercise common sense. It doesn't have a better idea. It doesn't think of a shortcut, right? It follows the rules, right? And if you had a semicolon out of place or a comma, it crashes, right? So that was a huge limitation on what could be done by traditional computing, trad computing. So now, let me just skip that figure. So now let's talk about the era that we've entered, okay? So artificial intelligence is doing tasks that look nothing like that set of following procedures that I just described, right? So we have machines that can learn autonomously from unstructured information. They can do tasks that we would think of as creative if they were done by people, like these illustrations up here. They can discover and invent things that we don't understand. And so, good example of that, AlphaFold. So from 1994 to the present, a biologist named John Molt ran an annual contest called the Critical Assessment of Protein Structure Prediction Competition. How many of you have entered that? Okay, I thought so. All right, so so what it is in structural biology, right, you need to know the shape of a protein to determine how it's going to interact with the body, right? That's crucial for medications. That's crucial for all kinds of devices. And the problem is biologists typically know the amino acid sequence of a protein, but the folding is much, much more harder to predict. So you can see this is an example of a protein, right? It looks like a party streamer, right? It's super complicated. So figuring out the folding structure of a single protein would be $1 million investment, $1 million grant. It would be a dissertation, right? It would be multiple graduate students over multiple years. So making progress on this is a hugely important problem. And so the CAST competition, at the beginning of a weekend, John Molt would give teams of biologists, a couple hundred teams, a series of amino acid sequences and ask them to predict the folding structure of the protein. And at the end of the weekend, they would be compared to the results. So the results were known to Molt, hopefully not known to these teams. And people would get 40% right, 50%, 60%. In 2020, or actually it was 2018, DeepMind, now owned by Google DeepMind, but not previously, introduced a piece of software as a contestant. The software was called AlphaFold. So Science Magazine wrote in December of 2020, the game has changed. Artificial intelligence has solved one of biology's grand challenges. John Molt said, this is a 50-year-old problem. I never thought I'd see this in my lifetime. And in fact, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry last month was awarded to Demis Hassabis and John Jumper of DeepMind for this piece of software, right? So this is an incredible accomplishment, and let's be clear, this could not have happened with traditional computing, right? There was no amount of following the rules to get you there. Even now, scientists don't really know what this thing is doing, right? It's predicting, but it's actually opaque how it makes those predictions. And that's actually a very important feature of AI, challenge of AI, that I'm going to come back to in a minute. Okay, so let's think about this. I want to come back to the work side, not the technology side. So let's say AI is a tool, right? It's a tool like a calculator or a chainsaw, right? And tools, how do workers think about tools? In general, our tools are not our competitors. Our tools are our friends, right? So if you're a doctor, you wouldn't want to be without your stethoscope. If you're a roofer, you wouldn't want to be without your pneumatic hammer. If you're an air traffic controller and you don't have a two-way radio, a radar, and a GPS, you're just a person standing in the field staring at the sky, right? You cannot do your work. So in many cases, tools are the critical component of our expertise because they shorten the distance between intention and action. Many of the things we do, we couldn't do without our tools. And so AI is a tool. So one future, one possibility is AI could increase the value of human expertise by extending its realm, by allowing us to do things we can't do using the knowledge that we have and going further with that. But not every tool is a friend of experts, right? So from 1894 till recently, if you want to drive a London black cab, you had to master what was called the knowledge. The knowledge is a 3-year memorization challenge to learn all the streets and highways and byways and thoroughfares and underpasses of the city of London. It is such an elaborate memorization task. They've actually done brain scans, and you can see a change in neurological structure of people's brains in the area where this memorization occurs, right? It's that consequential, what you're doing. Of course, when phone-based routing was introduced, right, that knowledge became economically irrelevant. It was stranded, right? Because not only does Waze or Google Maps, not only does it also know all those highways and byways, et cetera, but also knows how much traffic is on them at any given moment, which is something you could never memorize, right? So it's quite possible for technology to eliminate the value of expertise, even as it complements the value of other expertise. And expertise is what we're talking about here. Okay. So, and by the way, here are your London taxi drivers, and here's how they felt about Uber. This is the slide I call blood taxi. And let's be clear, why are they upset, right? They're not upset because routing will occur more efficiently, right? Because they'll find out about traffic and be able to avoid it. They're upset because the value of their expertise, the specific knowledge and ability to drive a cab efficiently and competently through London was all of a sudden no longer scarce. It was a commodity. Almost anyone could do it. In fact, the entry of Uber and Lyft and so on caused taxi drivers' wages to fall very rapidly until they unionized. Right? Okay, good. So let me think about, so now I want to talk about, well, where do we go with this? Well, let's start off by recognizing that even though you've only been using ChatGPT for a couple of years, AI has been built into your life in many ways for many years, right? So if your smartwatch asks you, have you taken a fall? Or your car tries to nudge you back into the lane on the highway, or your word processing application offers to assist you with your writing task, these are all cases of AI looking at what you're doing, trying to understand, anticipate, and predict what you would like, and help you to accomplish your objective. Right? So this idea of AI kind of whispering in your ear and making suggestions and kind of working with your judgment is what I want to talk about now. So there are good cases and bad cases. There's a peril, there's a potential, and they're connected by human judgment. So let me talk about that. Let me start with an example. This is a rather disturbing example, so trigger warning, about where this can go wrong. So in June 2009, Air France Flight 447 left for Rio de Janeiro on its way to Paris. Shortly after getting out over the Atlantic Ocean, the pitot tubes froze. The pitot tubes are just the speed sensors that tell the plane how fast it's going, information that is used by the autopilot. The autopilot, recognizing that it could no longer sense the velocity of the aircraft, degraded, meaning it just turned down its own setting and notified the pilot that it was turning down its own setting. So it partially disengaged, the plane rolled slightly. In the confusion, the crew stalled the aircraft. So what does it mean to stall an aircraft? So an aircraft, the way it gets lift is the Bernoulli effect, right? The the air passes over the wing. The top of the wing is slightly longer route than the bottom. And so the fact that it has to go a greater distance gives suction, right? There's less pressure. And that's what gives it lift. Stalling the plane means the angle of attack of the wing is so steep that the Bernoulli effect fails. You get cavitation and you lose lift. So the crew, for reasons that are unknown, brought the plane to a stall. The autopilot, for the entirety of this episode, because the voice recorders have been captured, is saying, stall, stall, stall. And the crew is heard saying, what is happening, I do not understand what is happening. So in the 3.5 minutes between when the autopilot shut off, or just degraded, and when the plane crashed, the crew never fully understood, perhaps in the last 30 seconds, what had gone wrong, and by then it was too late. The accident report for this collision, for this crash, said the crew lacked experience on the characteristics of high-altitude manual flying. This is an example of technology allowing human expertise to degrade, or humans allowing human expertise to degrade through their misuse of technology. Right? And this is a challenge. Now, this example may seem extreme, but let me give you another one that is much closer to the present. So this is a slide from a tool called CheXpert, Chest X-ray Expert, created by Stanford. And you can tell from the name of the tool that they did not have a marketing team involved, right? Because that's a terrible name. What does that even mean? OK, what does it do? It reads radiological scans, and it makes predictions about what it sees. So for example, a thing in red says edema, and then it says likely. And it circles the areas where it sees problems, gives you a prediction of what might be going wrong. And then radiologists can use that in conjunction with their own judgment to make a recommendation, right? Should you go for further assessment, or should you go home? So this is actually a pretty good tool. Working on its own without any other contextual information, so without any other patient data, it's as good as about 65% of radiologists, right? And you can see why this is a great application of AI, right? Because there's no hard and fast rules for reading an X-ray, right? It's a matter of judgment. You see stuff, it's not clear whether that's normal or abnormal. There's a range of possibilities. And so you develop judgment after many years of doing this. And because AI learns to recognize patterns, right? And AI can look at many more scans than any one doctor will look at in a lifetime. This is a great task for AI, for it to be able to make these types of predictions. So given this great tool, you might think that radiologists would do even better. But actually, they do systematically worse. Radiologists using CheXpert make more errors and misdiagnoses than they make on their own. Why is that? Well, it turns out, my colleagues Nikhil Agrawal and Tobias Sahls, who are two of the people who did this research, what they call correlated uncertainty. So the X-ray and the doctor are looking at the same picture, right? So when the doctor is confident, the software will typically be pretty confident of what it sees. When the doctor's uncertain, the software will typically be pretty uncertain of what it's seeing. So what should the doctor do when they're both uncertain? Well, what the doctor tends to do is defer to the computer. What should the doctor do when they're both confident, but they have different answers? The doctor will typically override the computer. Turns out both of those are the wrong instinct, right? So actually, when there's uncertainty, people are better at reasoning out of sample. They have more contextual information, right? They get the edge cases. When it's very clear, it's unlikely they'll disagree. But if they do disagree, the doctor should at least ask him or herself, hey, this thing's seen more X-rays than I'm going to see in 10 lifetimes. Am I sure that it's wrong? Am I sure that I'm right? Now, so this got bad results. But I think what you should be thinking, I'm sure you are thinking, is this is not a problem with the technology. It doesn't mean this technology couldn't be used well. It's a problem with the training. It's a problem the way this is set up, right? Doctors had no way to know whether they were using this well, right? When you're a doctor and you make a diagnosis, you don't get a green light or a red light telling you if you got the answer right or wrong, right? You just send it, you say, oh, go home, you're fine, or go for more treatment. You'll never find out. The only reason this is known is because my colleagues got a big grant and they did an experiment where doctors thought they were reading new X-rays of patients who had been recently scanned, but in fact they were reading old X-rays where the answers were known. So they could see how the doctors did with and without using this tool and figure out that actually the doctors were doing worse. And this is actually emblematic of an entire problem of design that we're all going to be facing, and especially you who are younger than myself, and I'm older than everyone in this room combined, for the rest of your careers, which is that we're going to be working with machines that are making suggestions, and we have to use our judgment. And how do we know when we're using it well and when we're not using it well? So this is a lot like that autopilot case. Not that the autopilot wasn't a good tool. It's that the pilots didn't have good judgment once it wasn't in operation. Same with this. OK, so now let me talk about the upside, augmenting human expertise. So I'm going to give you 3 examples from recent research. And the reason I want to give you research examples is because there's no general answer yet known to this question, right? People have only been working on this for a couple of years, and so all we have is a bunch of case studies. Some of them, and they're really, you should just think of them as parables or fables, right? They illustrate a point. They may or may not be the general answer, okay? So here's one study done by some students of ours, Shaked Noy and Whitney Zhang. What they did, this was in the, back a couple of years ago, this paper was published in Science in 2023, is they hired a bunch of people on Prolific, college graduates. Prolific is like MTurk for college grads, right? It's a kind of an online work platform. And they got them each to do 2 tasks. One task was to write a short marketing report. The other was to write some advertising copy. These tasks take about a half an hour. Halfway through, after the first task was done, and they said, use your regular tools. Use Google, use your word processor, use whatever you use. And then half of them, for the second task, were randomly assigned, said, hey, here's this thing called ChatGPT 3.5. Here's a little bit of training. Use it if you want to use it. So what happened? So the black line is the control group that did not get ChatGPT. The green line is the people who did. So you can see in the second round, the group that used ChatGPT got the work done much faster, about 40% faster. They went from 30 minutes to 18 minutes. The next thing that happened is the quality of the work actually increased. So they hired other college graduates, double blind, to assess the work on creativity, on brevity, on precision. And they found, and the group that used this tool did about a half a standard deviation better. So that's a lot better. Here's the most interesting result. This shows you the relationship between how people did on the first task and how they did on the second. So the black line is the control group that used the same set of tools both times. And you can see there's a slope of about 0.5. So if you did well the first time, you probably did well the second time. If you did badly the first time, you probably didn't do that well the second time. The green line is the folks who used ChatGPT. And you can see that slope is much shallower. Right? The least effective writer using ChatGPT 3.5 was about as good as the median writer not using it. Right? So it kind of allowed people to level up. It didn't make everyone equally good, and the best people were still best at it, but the people who were using this tool, it brought up the average and made the less effective people more like the more effective people. And that's unusual. Many tools or technologies amplify differences. Right? This is one that levelized differences, and this is really important, right? In all of human history, there's never been a time when people found writing to be easy, right? Writing is a really hard tool, and we've not had good tools for writing forever. I mean, word processing makes it easier to pound stuff out, but it doesn't improve your writing, right? So this is actually remarkable. Okay, let me give you another example. This is the use of a large language model for a customer support task. So let me see if I can briefly explain what this is. So this is a company that provides an enterprise product that everyone else's businesses run on, right? Their cash registers, their customer data, and so on. And so their clients, and the problem, they call in. And they say, hey, my name is Alex. I'm super frustrated. I've had customers calling me all day saying they can't access their information on the website or that the website isn't loading. I need this fixed ASAP. So then there are people who answer these calls and help them solve the problem. And you can see the first, the horizontal axis is how long people have been doing the job. The vertical axis is how many of these questions they're answering in an hour. So you can see when people start off, they're answering about 1.8 calls per hour. So it's taking about half an hour to resolve one of these questions. So this large language model is introduced, and what it does is it reads the text, so people chat in, right? And then it suggests possible answers. And the worker can answer, they can copy in that text, they can change that text, they can ignore that text. Right? So here's what happens. So the black line are people who never use the tool. And you can see over the course of 10 months of experience, they go from answering about 1.8 to about 2.5 calls per hour. Okay? The green line are people who, after 6 months, are given access to this tool. And you can see that they quickly surpass the people who don't use it. And they're answering about 3 calls an hour, or resolving about 3 problems an hour after a couple more months. The folks in red, right, they start off the same as everyone else. And then within 4 months, they are better than all the other workers. So there's a couple of things I want you to notice about this. One is everybody starts off bad at this job, right? Everyone starts off answering, under 2 calls an hour. So this tool does not make everyone good instantly. Instead, it enables them to converge towards expert work more rapidly. So that's actually unusual. It makes them learn, it helps them to learn faster. And another thing, right? As you might imagine, this is a really stressful burnout job, right? It's kind of like a road rage phenomenon, right? People chat in, they're hostile, they think you're a moron, you're slowing them down. The workers get really frustrated. And one of the actual surprises of this study was that the quit rate of novice workers in this job fell a lot. And one reason that may have happened, sort of sentiment analysis of the chat showed that the level of hostility from the customers to the workers and from the workers to the customers both declined. Okay? So it made the job less stressful and less unpleasant. And this is actually an interesting fact about artificial intelligence. It's really good at doing emotional labor, right? So I asked one of the authors of the study, said, like, well, what's the division of labor here? Does like the workers say, oh, I hear you, let me tell you about the problem, and then the computer says, here's the answer? And she said, no, it's just the opposite. The computer says, oh, I feel your pain. I've been there. Let me do da-da, and then it makes up a bunch of stuff that never happened to be sympathetic, and then the worker gives the answer, right? So it's a very unusual system. Okay, but so again, the point here I want to draw your attention to is this is another case of kind of leveling up, of skills convergence. Okay? Now I give you quite a different case, and this one is brand new. In fact, it's from a student of mine named Aidan Toner Rogers, and he studies generative AI and material science. Material science is basically creating new materials that has specific, so it might be a glue, it might be a type of metal that is stronger or lighter or more flexible. It's a big deal. So this first figure just shows you the rise of deep learning in material science publications. So this is all the publications that talk about using generative AI, all the PhD theses that record. So it's catching on. What it actually does, it's what's called inverse materials design. You start with a set of desirable properties, and then you reverse engineer to get a predicted structure that will have those properties. And in fact, it does, if you've heard of stable diffusion, right? It starts with a known thing. It adds noise, it turns into a random thing, and then it denoises it, right, to get back to something else. This is how AI works. So it's a really, really cool idea. It's hard to know how this was going to work. So the company, this material science company, did an experiment. They have over 1,000 PhD scientists, and they rolled out this inverse materials design software to different teams at different times. So let me explain what happened. So the first thing that happened is an incredible rise. So the rate of new materials discovery rose by about 40%. The number of patent filings rose by about 30%. And the number of product prototypes brought out rose by about 20%. And this is all within the first 20 months of when this tool was adopted, right? And this is comparing the teams that were using it to the teams that were not yet using it. Okay? So a huge impact. Now, here's the kind of cool finding, or one of the coolest. So I'll see if I can explain this. This is tricky. So there's 3 stages to this work, right? One is you get a bunch of ideas about what could work. Then you run a bunch of experiments on the ideas that look promising, right? And then you turn those into products if they turn out well. And so the way scientists do it, they work on their best ideas first, and then their second best idea, and so on. So they kind of prioritize them. So this shows you, the word they use, you will find this funny, is they measure scientists' discernment, which is actually their ability to tell good from bad ideas. And so scientists, so looking at high discernment, so let's look at all scientists as the first, and this is all scientists with AI and without AI. If you look in the second panel, it says bottom quartile. These are scientists who have the lowest level of discernment, right? They're not particularly good at telling good ideas from bad ideas. When they're working without AI, let's see if I can make this work. You can see they start with pretty good ideas, and then they move down to bad ideas. Once they start working with AI, they're as good as random. They cannot discern good from bad. Now, here's a scientist with good discernment, right? Here's how they do without AI. Here's how they do with it. They're able to tell good ideas from bad ideas. Why is this important? Well, what happens when they start using this tool is there's a huge change in their task allocation, right? They used to spend about 40% of their time on generating new ideas, right? This falls to 16%. Instead, they spend 40% of their time on judgment or discernment, deciding which ideas are worth experimenting on and which are not. So the scientists who have good judgment, just like those pilots, just like those radiologists, right, they get really good results out of this tool. Those scientists who do not have good judgment, right, they just waste time and money, and they don't have a lot of fun doing it. So in fact, if you look at people's attitudes, how did they like this job, right? So my student Aiden surveyed people, say, how do you like using this AI? And he arranged them into quartiles of their initial productivity, how good they were at this, from lowest, which is the first, to highest, which is the fourth. So first of all, most groups thought this improved their productivity. That's the blue line. Most people did not like their task allocation at all, because a lot of the creativity of the work was now being done by the machines. Only the most productive liked the thing overall, right? Even though they liked how they were using their time less, they liked the results they were getting enough that compensated them. So there's a lot in this study to think about, but the main thing the main common thread I'm trying to draw here is the judgment of the person is complementary to the technology, is complementary to the tool. It takes the right judgment to use a sophisticated tool to get good results. Let me give you like an incredibly concrete example, right? YouTube. So Gallup data says that more than 60% of American adults report that they use YouTube to do things they don't know how to do, right? Whether it's to fix something, to sew something, to solve a puzzle. Let's say that I happen to live in a 120-year-old house, and most of the house has circuit breakers, which are modern things for stopping electrical problems. But one part of the house has fuses, which are the old style. They're like light bulbs, right? And they're little filaments, and if there's a current surge, it burns out. Then you have to go to eBay and try to find a new one and plug it, right? And no one sells them anymore. So I might have the idea that I want to rewire my house and replace my fuse box with a circuit breaker. Well, I could go to YouTube. Literally, there are hundreds of videos on YouTube about how to replace your fuse box with a breaker box, right? So let's say I don't own a pair of electrical gloves, I don't know how to use an ohm meter, and I don't really understand principles of electricity, but that's okay because there's a Home Depot up the street, right? And I can just buy all the tools I need, right? So I could start out on this project, and I was surely, right, within a few hours, I would either electrocute myself or incinerate myself, right? Something is going to go wrong. It's not a good idea, right? If I'm a master electrician, why do I need the video, right? But let's say I'm someone who understands something about electrical circuitry. I replace light switches and things like that, but I've never done anything this ambitious. But I have some judgment. Probably I could use that video, right, and do this task, right? I could work it through. So the point I'm making is my judgment is a complement to this tool. It's not a substitute for it. I need to know something to use a tool that actually could get me into a lot of trouble. So let me give you a real-world thought exercise. This actually has nothing to do with artificial intelligence directly. Nurse practitioners. So there are now more than 300,000 nurse practitioners in the United States. They earn about $130,000 a year. 20 years ago, there were very, very few of them. So a nurse practitioner is a registered nurse who has an additional credential and additional training and can do diagnosis, treatment, and prescribing tasks that until recently were done only by medical doctors, right? It's a rare case of taking the most expensive, expert, rarefied task and delegating it to someone who's also expert but not quite as expert, right? How did this happen? Well, about 60 years ago, nurses got together and said, hey, we're being underused here, right? They're all women, of course. And they said, we're going to fight to create a credential, a curriculum, a certification that allows us to do additional stuff. And you can be sure the American Medical Association, right, fought like hell every step of the way to stop them, right? They did not want more people doing their work. And now they've created an occupation that is an expert occupation that works in conjunction with others and improves the quality of care, right? When you raise kids, you will discover that waiting to see your pediatrician is the worst day of your life. But if you see a nurse practitioner, you'll be seen right away. You'll get attentive care. And I created a high-paying job. And although nurse practitioners are not a technological phenomenon, at this point, they're hugely augmented by technology, right? They use electronic medical records. They use diagnostic software. They use software that looks for drug interactions and tells them what to prescribe and what not to prescribe together, right? So this is an example where technology is complementary to judgment, right? And it's easy to imagine a future where skilled medical professionals, like nurse practitioners, will do a greater range of tasks because they'll have better tools, right? And if that example makes you nervous, consider that in most of the world, the most educated medical professional around, if you're lucky, is a nurse. Right? And so you want that person to have tools to go as far as they can go with their expertise, although not further. Okay, so that's expertise. Now let me say, as I said a few minutes ago, these are just parables, right? We do not know the central tendency, right? We see this leveling up phenomenon in some places. We will also see job displacement. We will see superstar amplification, where all of a sudden one person can do the work of many, many. We'll see expertise that was valuable being diluted, right? So if someone says, should I be optimistic or pessimistic about the effects of AI on the labor market, you should say both, right? Because there's going to be some bad stuff as well as some opportunities. Okay, so let me end by thinking about a question that you probably may be asking. I keep talking about expertise, and you may be wondering, what about the end of work, right? Should I be worried about the expertise about jobs, or just will there be jobs, right? So if you're concerned about the end of work, right, you are in distinguished company. I'm not going to say good company. You're in distinguished company. Here's Elon Musk saying there'll come a point where no job is needed. Here's Jeff Hinton, the inventor of neural networks, who also won the Nobel Prize last month, right, saying, get a job as a plumber. So we have a future where either no one's working or everyone's a plumber, right? Neither of those sounds like a labor market that I would want to study. So let me tell you 2 reasons why I think this is wrong, why worrying about the end of work is the wrong thing to worry about. So let me start with the mundane reason and then move to a more profound reason. So speaking mundanely, we're not running out of jobs, we're running out of people, right? So in most of the rich world, the fraction of the population that is ages 20 to 64 the number, is declining in absolute magnitude. So in Korea, there will be a 40% reduction of people 20 to 64 over the next 40 years, right? And we know this with a fact, because most of those people are already born. We can't create more 30-year-olds now. We miss that opportunity, right? And this is true throughout the industrialized world, right? Populations are shrinking. And why is it a problem to have a smaller population? Like, why can't we just be a small country? Isn't that beautiful? The problem with that is when you shrink, you don't shrink uniformly across the age distribution. You run out of young people, and you have many older adults who expect to retire and be cared for. And that's an important responsibility, and it requires a lot of productivity and a lot of workers to make that happen, right? So it's a problem when countries age rapidly, as it's happening all through Asia. It's happening in Japan, happening in Western Europe, in China now as well. The US is actually relatively in good shape, but still has less than replacement rate birth rates. So without immigration, our population will get older pretty quick. So we're not running out of jobs. And in fact, since the pandemic, most of the world has seen tight labor markets, right, and rising wages reflecting demand for people. Now I want to caveat, right, the scarcity of workers in the rich world is a function of policy, right? There are people all over the world who would be glad to come to the rich world and work here, right, and would lead better lives for it, right? So that's the policy decision. There's no evidence, in fact, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary, that policy is not getting more liberal. Okay, so that's one reason. But let me give you an even more fundamental reason, which is that most profoundly important and consequential technologies, they don't actually automate work. Automation happens, but that's not the most important thing. So when machine-powered flight was invented, that didn't automate the way we used to fly, right? We just didn't fly. Or the scanning electron microscope did not automate the way we look at subatomic particles. We simply couldn't see them before we had this tool, right? If you were to go back to ancient Greece and automate all of the stuff they did, right, you would not have modern medicine, right? You have ancient Greece without horses, right? It wouldn't have flight. It wouldn't have electricity. It wouldn't have telecommunications. It wouldn't have penicillin, right? So what makes technologies fundamentally important is not what they automate, although they do automate, but the new capabilities they enable. Our lives are so different, not because of what's been automated, but because what we can do that we couldn't do without the technologies that we've created that have extended our capabilities. So let me just skip that in the interest of time. So in thinking about how do we want to use AI, right? The question is often said, well, what will AI do to us? But I think we should be asking, what do we want it to do for us? There are many different ways to use the same technology, right? Let's skip this as well. So one thing you can use AI for is population surveillance and censorship, right? And this is, China is incredibly good at this. The world's best. Is an incredible technological achievement. It would not be possible without AI, right? And but it's not intrinsic to AI, right? It's not what you had to use AI for. It's one way you can use it. You could similarly use it to assist with elder care, to provide real-time information to people who are doing construction or replacing their breaker boxes with fuse boxes, or you could use it to make education more immersive, more engaging, right? More accessible, cheaper, right? These are all possibilities. You can use it, another example, right? We have two great applications for the use of fissionable material in a controlled setting, right? One is to use it for nuclear warheads. Another is to use it for power generation, right? North Korea has, as you're all aware, an amazing arsenal of nuclear weapons. It has no nuclear power plants. Japan, which is the only country against which a nuclear attack has ever been launched, right, has no nuclear warheads and dozens of nuclear power plants, right? So that's a choice about technology, not just a choice, either of them could do both of these, right? It's a choice about what to prioritize. Okay, so let me end on a positive note. So here's the questions we should be asking when we ask, what do we want to do with AI? One, will we use it to empower and extend expertise to enable people to do things they couldn't previously do and make their judgment more valuable? Or will we use it to devalue expertise to displace workers? Both are possible, actually. If we wanted to extend expertise, how would we do it? It's not easy. That's actually a tough question. It's an R&D question. It's a question of figuring out, what do you prioritize? What do you invest in? And ultimately, this is a collective effort, and that's what makes it difficult, right? Because it's going to be decided not just by individuals, but by industry, by government, by universities, what they research, right? Trade unions, all of them are going to have a hand in shaping how we use this tool. So let me end with an example. This is literally true. My Whirlpool washing machine has more processing power than the Apollo guidance computer that was used to land the first lunar mission. And this allows me, even if I want to right now, I could start the rinse cycle on my washing machine from right here or anywhere on the planet that has Wi-Fi, right? And that's a completely worthless technology. My washing machine is never going to the moon, right? So the point there is there are different ways to use these tools. And when we think about what is a good use, in addition to replicating human capabilities, we should be looking for moonshots. That's where the opportunity lies. So let me stop there, and I welcome your questions.
Any questions, step up to one of the two microphones.
You know who you are. Yes.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Job.
Thanks.
So you mentioned that from what it seems like you need to have the judgment first, and then the AI will amplify those skills in that judgment.
Potentially.
How do you see AI being introduced into the classroom? Do you see AI or that judgment being taught first? And then how do you enable AI to further that judgment?
Yeah, it's a really hard question. It's a really important question. Yeah, people have to have the judgment to use the tool well. How do they get it, right? And the way we normally learn judgment is through going through the painful steps of learning, right? So, if you want to be an attorney, you're first going to start off as a paralegal or a junior lawyer. If you want to be a medical doctor, right, you don't start by operating on patients. You operate on animatronic dummies that scream and bleed, right? If you want to fly a commercial jet, you spend a lot of time in a flight simulator, right? So people spend a lot of time learning judgment. And the danger is that if these tools are so good, you'll never have the opportunity to develop that kind of reflex, right? And I think that's a super hard problem, and especially for education. Even though we don't ask people to learn timetables anymore, right, which I memorized when I was a kid, you still have to learn addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Why? You can still do that. You can do that on a calculator, because if you don't understand that well enough, you're going to put in 10 times 10 and get a billion, and you're going to think, oh, that's the right answer, right? You're not going to know. So I think this is actually a huge organizational design problem and a huge education problem, which is how do you get people to develop the judgment that they're going to need? And a good example actually is a person named Matt Bean, who was a PhD student at MIT. He studied robotic surgery. And robotic surgery is where surgeons operate robots, and the robots can do work more precisely than human hands can, but you have the surgeon overseeing. Well, it turns out robotic surgery requires many fewer assistants than traditional surgery. There are fewer people like suturing and sucking and whatever. And so the doctors do this really well, and nobody learns. They don't actually cultivate apprentices or juniors. And so he actually written a book about these. The juniors basically, they come and do procedures, operations on non-human things at night when the doctors aren't looking, just to develop this judgment, right? So I actually think this is going to be a huge challenge. So I said, you have these machines that are whispering in your ears, telling you what to do. How do you develop that judgment? I think it's a really super fundamentally profoundly hard problem.
Hi.
Hi.
So my question is, then, do you in the classroom do something different to help students gain that judgment?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question. Why do we even have classrooms, right? Because you can say, look, all the information's already out there, right? I mean, if we've had libraries for hundreds of years, why don't we just tell people to go to the library, right? It turns out that learning is an effortful task, right? It requires people to engage in a way that is challenging, and so part of the purpose of a class is to make that, one, like more lively, two, to stage it correctly, and three, to make it a high-stakes social setting, right? Why are classes more interesting than watching videos, right? Even if you're watching a video of the class, because a class, you're in there with other people, and someone could say something embarrassing, someone could say something funny, you could get it right, you could get it wrong, right? 10 years ago, people talked a lot about MOOCs, massively online open courseware, right? MOOCs have been a failure, largely. They have not delivered. Why have they not delivered? Well, most people don't like classrooms. And a MOOC is like a simulated classroom. So if you don't like a classroom, you're not going to like the simulated version that doesn't have people in it, right? So it's really a challenge to make education and work in a way that it draws people in. And the good scenario for how we would use AI for this is to make more things like simulation, right? To make things that are more like flight simulators, more like those animatronic dummies, so people can learn through experience and judgment, learn tacitly, not just formally. So that is the challenge. Yes?
So you mentioned that during the Industrial Revolution, there was, well, it started out really dangerous, but then we got like legislation, we got things like OSHA. Do you see any sort of legislation that you think is very likely that would be related to AI?
Yeah, great question. So the Industrial Revolution, just to clarify the point, there's a bunch of things that happened, right? So it wasn't just regulation, but it required regulation, right? It also, a lot of improvements in productivity, right? So without the productivity gains that came from the Industrial Revolution, regulation wouldn't have made people wealthier, right? But without the regulation, some people would have got wealthier, but not nearly as many, right? I think in terms of AI, so this is, we're actually having a conversation with a bunch of students earlier today, and it is, I think there's regulations required, but exactly what it's going to look like is actually not straightforward. And there's a question of, do you regulate it like AI in total, like these are the rules for AI, or do you regulate it how it's used in specific cases, right? And I think the latter often is how we work, right? So we don't regulate internal combustion, we regulate planes and cars, right? If you want to buy a toaster, you can't buy it unless it meets energy certification and fireproofing requirements. So we do regulate a lot of products. And AI, so if it's in a medical device, for example, and it's AI, it's carefully tested. If it's not in a medical device but used in a medical setting, it's not tested at all. And there's a problem, you're all aware of Epic, the company. They use LLMs in their software that doctors use for medical transcription, where they take notes or others use. And it does some of the things that that LLMs do, which is it's racist. So for example, if you, and this has been shown, if you start typing, white patient became anxious and difficult to control in the operating room or in the emergency room, it will say, was brought up to the such and such ward. If you say the same thing with black patient, it will say the police were called, right? That's what it will fill in, right? So there's a case. I'm sorry, that's a shocking example, but it's really true. It's for when you don't use this thoughtfully, right? you're going to get some pretty problematic results. And the real danger with AI often is that it is just rolled out, right? Just like the assumption with the Chexpert, right? It's a good tool, therefore we'll get good results. That does not follow, right? The fact that it's a good tool doesn't mean used by people, it will be used well. So let me, rather than give an extended essay, let me say the place where I think where regulation is most incredibly important and missing right now is in intellectual property. Fair use doctrine was not designed for machines that could read all the books and watch all the movies and look at all the art and then do something with that. It was designed to limit how other humans would use intellectual property. And it's a problem because eventually it will steal the IP of artists, of journalists, of writers, of creators. And that's a problem. We need people to be remunerated for that work or they just won't do it. And we're used to paying for other people's intellectual property, not just when you buy a book or go to a movie, but even when you listen to a song on Spotify, right? A small payment is made on your behalf to the copyright holder of that music, right? This should be done with AI, and it is doable with AI. This is not actually a technical problem. This is a legal problem. So I think that's the first place I would start regulating, though by no means the last.
You had mentioned that when the Industrial Revolution, not only were jobs diminished in value, but some were increased. So with the way AI is going, do you see kind of an obvious bell curve or in a way that you would consider surprising with the AI technology?
Yeah, I mean, so super good question. So I made the argument that the computer revolution led to this kind of hollowing out, right? There were many of these middle skill jobs were replaced by machines. Many people now think that a lot of the place where AI may be substitutable will be actually in the professions, right? Now, there's two ways to look at that. One way is, oh my God, poor doctors, poor lawyers, poor engineers, poor professors, right? Their skills are becoming less scarce. Another way, there are two other ways to look at it is, wow, healthcare, education, right? Design services, legal services, they may become cheaper, right? Which would be very good. Another way to look at it still, which I think is the most compelling, is maybe people who don't have as rarefied an education could do more of that valuable work. That's why I find the nurse practitioner's example so inspiring, right? Nurse practitioners are highly educated professionals, but they have 5 fewer years of education than doctors, and they're doing things that doctors used to do. So if more people could do coding, if more people could do skilled medical care, if more people could do legal services, if more people could do construction and design, right, because they had better tools, that would be a good possibility. But I stressed earlier, I don't know what the average answer is, right? I don't know what the central, I can give you these parables of leveling up. I could tell you about the scientists, where only the best scientists use Gen AI well in materials discovery, and it's way too early to say what the central tendency is. So but the final point on this, we do have a lot of choice about this, depending on how we design it, right? A lot of these tools embody values, right? Is the purpose of the tool to replace the worker or to make the worker more effective, right? AI is used in nursing now. In some places, AI acts as basically a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of your nanny looking over your shoulder and telling you if you violate procedure, if you don't follow the guidelines. Well, often medical professionals don't follow the guidelines because they have a better idea, right? That's not a very good way to use it. That's just going to make people risk averse, right? Another way to use it is to surface information to help them make better decisions, right? Those are design choices. And so I think how we design AI will affect how we design the principles of how we use it will have an effect on how it works out. Yes?
Thank you very much. Wonderful talk. I really love this slide, and I love all previous slides too. Beyond replicating human
Which one do you like best?
capabilities, we should be looking for moonshots. My question is, how do you consider AI as a moonshot, or how we can nurture more moonshots? If we look back in human history, right, I feel like there are thousands of years there were no moonshots.
That's right.
And then there were moonshots.
That's right.
And now 100 years ago, if you ask people about smartphones, they would have no idea, right?
Yeah.
So if we take smartphones as a moonshot, today, smartphones are changing, but the changes are no longer moonshots changes. They're just incremental, adding photo capabilities and all those.
Yeah.
when can we have the next moonshot? Because it seems that without the moonshot, then So
I mean, so the nature of moonshots, right, is it's an act of imagination, right? It's the most natural thing to do with a new tool is what you did with the old tool, but do it faster, right? And what is remarkable about a new tool is it gives you a new capability, right? And it often takes decades to figure out what those capabilities are, right? We had electricity and even switches long before we had computers. So we had the ingredients, we just didn't know what to make with it, right? GPS, right, was a military technology, the global positioning system, right? It didn't become a commercial technology until Korean Airlines Flight 007 flew accidentally over Soviet airspace and was shot down because it was thought to be an enemy aircraft. And President Reagan said, we're going to make GPS available to civilians. And now it's in everything, right? There's no app on your phone that doesn't use GPS to figure out where you are, whether you know it or not. So if you ask me what are the most, could AI be most productive? I would say in improving, not just improving the effectiveness of medicine, but improving the availability, lowering the cost. There's infinite unmet medical need, right? If we could do this better and faster, in improving the way we educate, making it more immersive, and also some of the biggest problems that we face as humanity, many of them are political, and AI's going to make those worse, but climate change, agriculture that takes up too much land, public health, the problem of human lack of education, right? These are problems that are partly technical problems, and we could get much better at them. So I see those are the moonshots I would be targeting, but of course, there may be a much better one that I'm not able to imagine at the moment. We should invest, exactly. That's right. So that's right. So that's important. It's not just regulation, right? It's steering. Actually, the society has a huge role in steering technology, right? A lot of the things that we use now came out of the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health. So the government actually plays a role in setting the direction of technology, not just saying what don't do with it, but what do we want to do with it? And so yes, it requires investment. It requires investment. You know what you're looking for. It's not readily achievable, and you invest to achieve it. Okay, I can't remember who is next.
So you've mentioned a lot about AI's impact and maybe going to the professional part of the workforce.
Yeah.
What are your comments on the professions? Like I'm a physical therapist. We talk about medical professions that require a license to practice, right? So when you go to school for 3 years, you pay a lot of money to take this licensing exam to be able to get your job and treat patients in my case. What is your thought about AI's impact on that aspect of it?
On licensing or on physical therapy?
On the professions that have to get a license to practice.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, so licensing is a complicated mixed blessing, right? On the one hand, licensing is necessary. You don't want to go to doctors, and it's not what economists call an experience good, that you go to this doctor and you're like, oh, that one killed me, a bad choice, I'll go to a better one next time, right? So licensing is there to protect consumers. On the other hand, sometimes licensing is used to prevent competition, right? So I mentioned how medical doctors have fought against nurse practitioners, not because nurse practitioners aren't good at what they do, because doctors don't want that encroachment. So I think ultimately the technical capabilities create pressure on licensure. If there's really a much cheaper, faster way to do things, eventually the licensing will tend to get eroded somewhat. But I think physical therapy is an activity in which it's a perfect mixture of human dexterity, flexibility, hands-on care with expertise, right? You need to know something, and you need to be able to do something. It's a domain in which it would be very difficult for automation to occur. I'm sure it'll be augmented, but I don't think people will go to physical therapy bots anytime in the nearly foreseeable future. Yeah.
Hi. Oh, sorry. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, you kind of saw how everything switched to being online. And even nowadays, when you're applying to jobs, there's like hybrid options where you can work from home. Yeah. So do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic kind of pushed the reliance of using like electronics, including like the use of AI on us?
I think the COVID-19 pandemic changed the way we work, and so sped up a lot of things that could be delivered remotely. And there's a lot of evidence that companies are doing more foreign outsourcing and even distributing where work occurs within borders in different places, right? Less in cities. I think it also actually reminded us what are the benefits of being in person, right? Like Zoom no longer allows people to work from home, right? The company Zoom, think about that, right? The day Zoom ended work from home, we know that there must be some limitations. So I think it reminded us that some of what we did was an artifact of not having good tools for this, but some of it turns out there's a lot of advantages in working in person, right? I go to my university because I learn from my colleagues, and the students learn from interacting with one another. So it did accelerate a shift that would have happened more slowly if COVID hadn't happened. But it didn't, I think we bumped up against a limitation simultaneously. So we're still figuring out what works that way and what is lost.
Let's do these last two questions.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
So today we talked about sort of pessimistic versus optimistic use cases. We talked about regulation.
Yeah.
We also talked about huge differences between countries in terms of access to expertise and labor.
Yep.
And so I could see pretty big differences in what countries have to gain in use of AI or having less or more to lose.
Yep.
And differences in what they think is appropriate to regulate. So do you think about international treaties for the use of AI, or even game theory about which countries are going to push things to the limit more than others, and what do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, sure. So I do think about the sort of international ramifications, and there's a lot of them, right? Some have to do with defense, some have to do with espionage, with interference, and so on. I guess the one I think about most is the role in economic development. And there's just huge disparities in income. And people have asked for decades, why haven't all these Western technologies allowed less affluent countries to get as wealthy as ours? They can all have computers. They can all have, what's going wrong? And there are many things. But one thing is many Western technologies are not suitable for developing countries because they require the kind of infrastructure that's in there, right? So you should not build a nuclear power plant, right, if you're a low-income country without a lot of engineers and with a lot of infrastructure to support that safely. But there are occasional exceptions to that rule. So mobile telephony was the rare Western technology that was more valuable to the developing world than to the rich world, right? Because everything you do on your phone, you could pretty much do on your desktop computer without your phone. But that was never true in India or sub-Saharan Africa, right, where you didn't have landlines. So you didn't have the ability to call your distant relatives. You did not have mobile banking. You didn't have the ability to get weather or price information or crop information. So mobile phones, 2/3 of living adults have a mobile phone, even though mobile phones are quite expensive for many people in the world. And the reason is they are such an essentially valuable tool. So AI, I think, potentially, is a little bit more like mobile telephony. Like, sure, it costs billions of dollars to stand up a foundation model, but anyone can use it from any mobile device anywhere in the world. And if you say, what is the scarcest thing in developing countries more than in the rich countries, it's expertise, right? Expertise in medicine and engineering and software and law. Now, you can get out over your skis with these tools. You can do things that are dangerous without understanding it. But on the other hand, it's going to reduce scarcity in those domains. So I think the greatest potential is it will allow more indigenous development for people to use their expertise in tools more effectively. So that's the best case scenario, I would say, for that one.
Hi, so my question kind of wanted to ask you more about maybe any kind of information you would think of or what you might speculate, even a little bit on the legal end of things like AI in terms of deepfakes and things along that realm that are really starting to violate people's privacy and autonomy as a whole. Is there more things you would see maybe with a legal implication of fair use of AI, limiting the use of AI? Is there more of a criminal end to it to start to say that as much as AI is something that is for things like this, it can be taken in the exact opposite direction? Is there any kind of something coming on the
absolutely. No, I think those are very serious risks. Both the deepfakes, the pornography, and and misinformation. And I think and they're hard to regulate, but they should be regulated, right? Obviously, you may not be able to regulate the tool itself, but you can regulate the people using it, right? So, you don't have to spend much time online to read about horrible things done to mostly high school girls, with kind of fake pornography and so on. So I think and you say, well, aren't there laws against this? And the answer may be there aren't, because you don't make laws against things that are just impossible to do, right? We don't have to have a law against, you can't, peer inside my head and see what I'm thinking because it's just not possible. But all of a sudden we have many new possibilities, right? The availability of surveillance, the availability of fake content and so on. And so it creates a real challenge for regulation. And I do think it's dangerous and it's polarizing. And we're living in an information ecosystem that's so different from 50 years ago. When I was in college back in the 1800s, facts were hard to come by, and you would go to the library and you collect them and you put them in a little case and you bring them back, you write a paper about them, and you were very proud of them. And now, there's an infinite amount of information online, but a lot of it's garbage. And so the challenge is not to get information, it's to figure out what you can trust and what you can't trust and how to synthesize that. And that's a very hard problem. And I think people are finding that more challenging all the time, understandably. And regulation is going to be necessary. The question is whether we have the tools to actually control. Where are those choke points? So I think it's going to be a very challenging situation. All right, thank you very much.